Good morning, friends. Let us start with a plea. God of justice, God who liberates, give us the wisdom and courage to see the wounds around us, to name the struggle we don't see, to love what has been unloved, and to intercede in solidarity. Amen. Many in this part of the world refer to the Pacific Ocean as the Moana, the Alai Moana, or the pathway, the Yalomatua, or the wise elder. Today, the Pacific faces another environmental challenge, apart from climate change and others. Alofa lava, Pulavinaka, hello, aloha. Welcome to this webinar on ecological racism and deep-sea mining in the Pacific. I bring you greetings and maloma from the Pacific. I am Upolu Luma Vaai, principal of the Pacific Theological College in Suva, Fiji. And with me is co-moderator Athena Peralta, who serves as the program executive for economic and ecological justice at the World Council of Churches. The objective of this webinar is threefold. First is to establish a potential link between deep-sea mining and racism. Racism is not just a human issue of color and race. Indigenous communities have for centuries suffered from systemic racism imposed by unfair economic structures and policies created in another context by another race that normally extract and remove resources from one race or ethnicity to benefit them. Many Pacifica communities are structured around the notion of ecological kinship, that everything is genealogically connected and related. Therefore, everything is seen as flesh, bones, and blood. The earth is family, an ancestor. This, therefore, extends the notion of racism. In kinship genealogy, Pacifica people see all of life on earth as multiple living races or faces, forming an inextricable ainga or household. Second is to open up critical conversations and facing with honesty and courage as a global community the challenges of deep-sea mining in the Pacific and beyond. And third is to raise awareness as much as possible around this issue. We welcome you all and thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Upolu. Indeed, we welcome our participants who are joining us from different regions, from different time zones. And we especially want to welcome our distinguished speakers who are coming from the Pacific, but also from other parts of the world. I take this opportunity to introduce them. It is a joy to have with us His Eminence, Cardinal John Ribat. He is the Archbishop of Port Moresby, Papua New Guinea, and he is Papua New Guinea's first Cardinal. He served as President of the Catholic Bishops' Conference of Papua New Guinea and the Solomon Islands from 2011 to 2014 and has held the role of Chairman of the Catholic Bishops' Conference of Oceania since 2012. It is also important to say that His Eminence has been actively engaged in issues of climate change and mining in the Pacific. We also have with us Honorable Ralph Regenvanu, who is currently serving as a Member of Parliament for Vanuatu, and this is his fourth term. As a former Minister of Lands and Natural Resources, he initiated a national awareness raising and consultation on deep sea mining. And Ralph has been the leader of the opposition in Vanuatu since a change in government after the 2020 general elections. Also from the Pacific, we have Maureen Penjueli. Maureen is currently the coordinator for the Pacific Network on Globalization. She has over 2 decades of experience working mainly in the field of environmental, economic, political, and social justice in the Pacific region, as well as in promoting Indigenous peoples' right to self-determination. It is also a pleasure to have with us Catherine Coumans. Catherine serves as the research coordinator and Pacific program coordinator at Mining Watch, which is based in Canada. She has written numerous reports and academic articles on mining since conducting her PhD in the Philippines. And she is deeply involved in community-level human rights work and work with Indigenous peoples, especially communities affected by Canadian mining companies. And finally, but not the least, we have Kristina Gjerde. Kristina is Senior High Seas Advisor to the IUCN's Global Marine and Polar Program. Kristina received her Juris Doctor from New York University School of Law with a focus on international and admiralty law. So for the past 30 years, Kristina has been focused on the nexus of law, science, and policy relevant to sustaining marine biodiversity. So as you can see, friends, we have an exciting panel of speakers. Our webinar today employs the Talanoa methodology. And this is a dialogical, a non-hierarchical storytelling approach that is very much rooted in Pacific traditions. So Upolu and I, as moderators, will be raising some questions and some concerns, and our speakers will be responding through stories, through experiences, and through their own concerns. So we thank the G20 Interfaith Forum for creating this platform for Talanoa on this emerging and very important ecological issue.
Thanks, Athena. The webinar goes for an hour and a half. Of course, Pacific Talanoa cannot be limited by time. However, because of the time slot given to us, we've asked the speakers to respectfully honor the time allocation for each Talanoa responses to ensure that all our speakers gets a chance to speak. For participants, please mute your audio at all times. If there are any questions or comments, in particular the questions, please put them in the Q&A box below your screen, and with any comments, you can put them on the chat. Our team will organize the questions for our speakers to respond to. Your comments will also be very valuable in mapping the coverage of the issue and summary of the webinar. Now, let us Talanoa.
So our first question, I think we will start with Catherine. Catherine, it is said that the Pacific could be the last mining frontier on the planet. Now, for some, deep sea mining is not something new. For instance, the International Seabed Authority, goes back to almost 20 years, and they have been looking at this. But for many, in the Pacific, but not just in the Pacific, deep sea mining is new to their ears. So could you explain what exactly is deep sea mining? I mean, we are familiar with your usual land-based mining, but what exactly is deep sea mining? And can you name some of the projects that are already existing or being planned in the Pacific, as well as the entities that are behind them?
Thank you, Athena. And thank you to the organizers for inviting me to this important Talanoa. And let me just start by saying that the reality that our deep ocean floor may actually be mined in the near future is very shocking, even to my fellow Canadians when I tell them about it. It is the reality. It is one of the really big challenges we face, that so few people around the world are aware that this ecological threat is now imminent. So what is deep sea mining? Well, the deep seabed areas that are being targeted for mining are between 800 meters and 6 kilometers in depth. At these depths, there is no sunlight. There is immense pressure. And by 4 kilometers down, the temperature is close to freezing. These parts of the ocean are the least explored areas on Earth. More people have been to the moon than have been to the deepest parts of our oceans. And yet, despite the extreme conditions, there is an abundance of unique life at these depths, most of which has yet to be discovered. The 3 ecosystems targeted for destruction by metal mining are themselves critical habitats for deep sea marine life. They are seamounts, hydrothermal vents, and polymetallic nodules. Seamount crusts and polymetallic nodules take millions of years to form, and if destroyed by mining, they will be gone, effectively forever. The animals that depend on these habitats are unique and cannot be found anywhere else on Earth. The deep sea life in the proposed mining areas is linked to all the marine life above it, all the way to the surface, so that scientists are very concerned about the impacts on shallower species that people depend on for their livelihood and food security. So how can this deep sea mining even happen? Well, deep sea mining can be permitted by countries in their own territorial waters. The Canadian company called Nautilus was granted the first ever deep sea mining permit, and it targeted hydrothermal vents in Papua New Guinea's waters. I'm sure Cardinal Ribat will tell us more about that. Just this month, though, the Cook Islands authorities have approved 3 exploration licenses, one to a US company called Odyssey Marine Exploration. This company is right now suing the Mexican government for a reported $3.5 billion because the government refuses to grant them a license to mine the seabed. If the mining is going to happen in international waters, permits must be granted through the International Seabed Authority. 31 15-year exploration contracts have already been granted by the ISA. Of these 31 exploration permits, 22 are for polymetallic nodules and seamount crusts in the Pacific. The wealthy countries and companies, such as Lockheed Martin, behind these projects are or are based in, among others, Canada, the UK, Belgium, Germany, France, China, Japan, Korea, and Singapore. Wealthy countries. The Canadian company behind 3 exploration contracts in the Pacific is the Metals Company, formerly known as Deep Green. Principal executives in this company made a tidy profit from Nautilus Minerals, the company that ended up costing the PNG government about $125 million when it went bankrupt. I'll leave it here, but I think a picture is starting to emerge of the impacts happening in the Pacific and the profits flowing to the wealthy countries and companies involved in deep sea mining. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Catherine. That was an exciting start to our Talanoa this morning. Sister Maureen, the discovery of minerals and riches has sparked what we now call the race to the bottom, an ocean mining mania. But it has also raised concerns around environmental impacts. Many scientists are in consensus that deep sea mining is moving into something that we know little about, the seabed, as Catherine was referring to. We know that the Pacific race of people, communities, wholly depend on the ocean for livelihood. As a Pacific Islander and as an ocean activist, we hope you can share with us the impacts of this deep sea mining, its benefits, as well as its risks. Thank you, Maureen.
Really, thank you for inviting me, and my responses in this Talanoa session today will be on behalf of Really Poor, so I hope that you can hear me. But I think your question, Dr. Upolu, raises a significant other questions that I think we should be thinking about at this particular point in time. It raises questions on who is and what is framing the Pacific Ocean from a resource point of view. This idea about who stands to benefit is quite critical. I want to touch a little bit about questions of value. What is it that we value today? I think that's quite critical, and perhaps to then locate description of cost before we talk about benefits. One of the key problems that we have with mining, what it's like to overemphasize the benefits. Just from a framing point of view, the Pacific is described as an underexplored, underexploited region of the world. It is the new resource frontier and particularly important for kickstarting the blue economy, if you like. And so we live in this kind of age where we know the costs of everything, but really the value of absolutely nothing. And we're in real dangerous grounds where we can calculate the cost of what these minerals look like. When the proponents of DSM look at these minerals, they see vast areas of car batteries, wind turbines, computers. They see this in terms of, dollar signs, euro, USD, AUD, NZD. Everyone looks at it from a very particular economic valuing of the system. I want to come back to your opening statement, Dr. Upolu, because I think it's worth emphasizing what is it that we value when we look at this ocean system. And the ocean, we belong to the ocean. We are part and in living kinship with this entity. And that's why it's so significant to look at DeepSea Mining within the context of values. Understanding cost and consider what it really means in terms of the cost to ecology. But perhaps very quickly, just on cost, and I think this is something that our governments, particularly here in the Pacific, really have to pay attention to. In summary, it's worth us thinking about cost in terms of what is it that we will destroy. So we will destroy unique deep sea ecosystems that have taken millions of years to form. One, systems that we do not fully understand or appreciate its functions. And this is in the wider context of climate functions. But more than that, there are so many things that we simply do not understand. The destructions of these deep sea ecosystems will cause mass extinction of species. Many of these species are yet to be discovered. They're endemic to sites. So, these are species that have survived millennia through heat, cold, salinity, pressure, and darkness. Radiation is not possible within human timescales. The scale of destruction is quite necessary. When deep sea mining was proposed in the region, one of the biggest challenges that we've had is that it is framed as having little to no impact and the staggering benefits that you'll gain out of it. So in terms of scale, it is quite clear that it will not just affect the seafloor, so you can measure that in kilometers. It will also affect water columns, so species within water columns that have high economic value to our countries, but also from indigenous points of view, these are very important species for cultural practices, etc. So sharks, whales, dolphins. So we need to really grapple with cost before we deep dive into this idea that we stand to benefit. Because I think that's one of the greatest challenge, really looking at where and what is the things that we value and what are the costs that we're proposing through deep sea mining. Thank you, Dr. Upolu.
And thank you, Maureen, for really raising the costs and benefits of deep sea mining, looking beyond the usual financial metrics. The next question is for Your Eminence, John. Papua New Guinea was one of the first countries to issue a commercial license to a mining company, Nautilus, which was mentioned earlier, for deep sea mining in the Bismarck Sea. And you have been, as a Pacific Church leader, you have been at the forefront advocating against this project. And we would like to know why the Papua New Guinea government opted for deep sea mining. And we would also like to know how the people responded to this issue, and in particular, how the church and how indigenous communities in Papua New Guinea responded. What are the potential risks that were identified at that time, not just for Papua New Guinea, but also for the entire region of the Pacific?
You know, the question is, how did the Papua New Guinea government opted to enter into this project? So the Papua New Guinea government saw this as a golden opportunity to get more revenue, that it even obtained a loan for 400 million kina from the bank in Papua New Guinea, Bank of South Pacific. And with that, the government bought shares, about 15%, to buy 15% equity of the project. And that has given the first ever deep sea mining permit for the deep sea mining. A mining license number 154 was granted to a Canadian company, Nautilus Minerals New Guinea Limited, in December 2009 for Solwara 1 project in the Bismarck Sea, north of the coastal areas of New Ireland and East New Britain provinces. And Papua New Guinea is seen as a mining state. The country relies on so much of its natural resources, including oil, gas, copper, gold, and other valuable minerals that the mining and the petroleum sectors have contributed to around 20% of the country's gross domestic product. This is why the Papua New Guinea government explored another way of mining, which is the seabed mining. Now, there was a lot of debate and opposition to the project since 2011. Local communities have asked the information on the environment, social, cultural, and economic impacts on Solwara 1 project. So the coastal communities even launched legal proceedings against Papua New Guinea government in December 2017 to have access of the project documents. The provincial government of New Ireland, where the mine was really centered, was crying out foul on how the government gave license to the Nautilus company. A group of people concerned about the implications of deep seabed mining had series of discussions and went through the media to make people aware of what is going on in relation to the deep sea mining. Alliance and the group of people are these: the Alliance of Solwara Warriors, led by Jonathan Mesulan. Another group, the Center of Environmental Law and the community rights through its director, Peter Bosip, the Catholic Bishops' Conference of Papua New Guinea and Solomon Islands through Mari Mondu, the Development Secretary, and the Coffee Industry Support Project, Caritas and Social Communication of Catholic Bishops' Conference of Papua New Guinea and Solomon Islands, and many more, that until this time, there is a call to the government to cancel all the mining licenses given to Nautilus. So what were the potential risks identified at the time, not just for Papua New Guinea, but also for the region? The environmental effects on mining are felt at the local, regional, and even global scales through direct and indirect mining activities. Erosions, sinkholes, for example, take what has happened in Tonga and also in Papua New Guinea before, during the tsunami, and the loss of diversity and the total degradation of the seabed, and in this case, with the critical issue of climate change, this deep sea mining will aggravate the present situation with the increase of carbon emissions in the environment. The destruction caused by deep sea mining not only leads to the destruction of the ocean floor, but also to the whole ecosystem, including us human beings.
Thank you, Your Eminence, for the talanoa this morning, and sharing your experience in your part of the world. The other talanoa point, Dr. Kristina, you have 3 decades of experience around science and international policy and laws for protecting the moana, the ocean. Would you explain some of the international laws, policies of the sea, agreements, and their connection and relevance to the deep sea mining in Pacific? Hope you can help us with that question, especially most of our participants and most of us are not aware of these international laws and policies.
Well, thank you very much for the honor of being here and as part of your household. I will take you back on a story, because I am self-educated in the laws of the sea myself. That I started out studying international law, but not international environmental law, the law of the Sea Convention, the basic framework that sets forth international rights and obligations of states in the marine environment, had only recently been agreed back in, I hate to say, 1982, when I was in law school. So all these developments about the need to better protect the marine environment have actually emerged since then. But the law of the Sea Convention provided a very healthy and hefty tooth that said that all states have the obligation to protect and preserve the marine environment. However, what it didn't do was to establish the frameworks and the processes to actually help implement that obligation. Instead, the 2 concepts in the law of the Sea Convention, the freedom of the seas, which meant that all states have the right to access the ocean for fishing, for shipping, sort of paved the way for more of a few decades of exploitation, with too little attention put to this environmental protection. When I made the transition from private law of shipping to actually the international ocean law of protection, it was because I fell in love with coral reefs in Palau, that the fish and the sea turtles and the colorful corals that I thought were well worth protecting more than the international shipping companies. So my heart has long been in the Pacific. But I then had to educate myself as to what are the best international tools and policies to do so. So I looked at shipping. Well, can you reroute ships around the reefs? Well, yes, you can, but it's hard to prove that you're in imminent threat of damage. That's where you need the precautionary principle. Can you establish protected areas for fishing? Well, it's hard to get a fishing closure agreed, at least at the international level, where economic interests often prevail. When it came to mining, the regime set forth by the Law of the Sea Convention with respect to seabed mining was, I hate to admit, quite exciting in the very beginning. Here, the Law of the Sea Convention actually recognized the seabed area and its resources as the common heritage of mankind, humankind, we'd now say, and established the International Seabed Authority to act on behalf of all humankind. What this meant was that the International Seabed Authority is an international institution comprised of all the member states of the Law of the Sea Convention, 167 now, were charged with administering this new activity, with ensuring that we had an effective knowledge base so that any future activities related to seabed mining could be conducted to ensure effective protection of the marine environment, to build capacity of developing countries, to help share in the benefits of seabed mining, including financial benefits, and to actually help develop this new international economic order that was somehow going to lift everybody from poverty and from dire straits. But sadly, I've been increasingly disillusioned, and now entirely disillusioned, about how the system operates in practice. The International Seabed Authority is being managed on behalf, basically, of private interests who are trying to accelerate seabed mining now, while they can still continue this narrative that we need these minerals for the transition to a carbon-free economy. The challenge that we see is that at the same time, the ocean has not been getting any healthier. We have continued to assault the ocean with overfishing, pollution. We have adopted the so-called Sustainable Development Goals back in 2015, trying to chart a more sane path forward that benefits people and the planet, as well as provide some form of economic security for us all. The challenge is particularly with respect to Sustainable Development Goal number 14, which talks about life underwater, or coastal and seas and ocean resources. And here they talk about both fostering the economy of small island developing states with respect to sustainable blue economy activities. And they also talk about the need to restore the resilience of the marine environment, to protect and manage coastal and marine ecosystems, and avoid significant adverse impacts. So if you put the Law of the Sea Convention obligations to ensure effective protection, combined with the Law of the Sea Conventions to actually be operating on behalf of humankind as a whole, in our own best interests, including future generations, as well as this basic understanding in the Sustainable Development Goals that we need to be setting ourselves forward on a path towards sustainable development that does not undermine living ecosystems, or in other words, cost us the earth, that we really need to start putting our thoughts together as to how can we consider deep seabed mining consistent with the ocean needs of the time, with the ecosystem needs of the time, as well as the people's needs of this time. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Kristina, for shedding light on this particular area. Now, back to Catherine, and also building on what Kristina has just said. Part of the problem is that international law of the sea policies around this area sometimes never find their way to grassroots communities. I mean, it's too technical. So we would like you to share something about consent. Who should give consent? Is it fair for the international community to create laws for the use of someone else's ocean without the initial consent of communities who are actually stewarding that ocean?
Thank you. This question raises so many important issues. These are issues of Indigenous rights to free, prior, and informed consent, of the difference between consent and consultation, of social license, and even of what we actually mean when we say that the international seabed is the common heritage of humankind. As we've heard from Dr. Gjerde just now, decisions were made to permit mining in the seabed in international waters in the late 1980s and in the early 1990s. Many people who will be impacted if deep seabed mining goes ahead were not even born then. In 1994, the International Seabed Authority was created, which we've been mentioning. And even to this day, very few people have ever heard of this institution. It is tucked away in Jamaica, where it is difficult for the global public to even attend meetings. And it has the mandate, the right, given to it in the early 1990s to carve up the international seafloor and give it away to profit-seeking corporations and countries, even though the very serious and long-lasting harm to million-year-old habitats, fragile deep-sea species, and the web of life in the oceans that will come from mining the seabed is only now well understood. Mining companies love to say that it'll be great to mine the seabed because there are no people down there that you have to move out of the way or whose consent you have to seek. This perspective ignores impacts on coastal communities who rely on the sea for their food security, their livelihood, and their cultural continuity. It ignores impacts on commercial fishers who rely on the sea for their livelihood. It ignores impacts on the global community, all of us who rely on a healthy sea for every breath we take and for carbon sequestration. So let's look at free, prior, and informed consent. Firstly, the ISA, the International Seabed Authority, and the mining companies are not seeking anyone's consent. They are engaging in a limited public consultation on things like finalizing international regulations for deep seabed mining and on environmental impact assessments for particular projects. Further, people cannot consider if they want to give or withhold their consent to seabed mining if they are not fully informed. That's why it's called free, prior, and informed consent. But governments, the ISA through its Secretary General, and the mining companies are all emphasizing the promotion of deep seabed mining in their communications. They are trying to sell it to us. They are not being upfront about the very real risks to marine ecosystem sustainability and the cascade of unintended consequences that can come from destroying the foundation of life in the seas. So who can we turn to become informed for the truth? We can turn to marine scientists and experts. Over 622 marine science and experts from 44 countries have signed a statement calling for a moratorium on deep seabed mining. They do this based on their in-depth knowledge of the unacceptability of the risks. And even if we're not asked for our consent, we can reach out to our government agencies and decision makers and let them know that we oppose this destructive exploitation of the seabed. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine, for that very important wisdom from you. Honorable Ralph, thank you for the work that you've done in the Pacific. We know that racism takes many forms, in particular, if it flows through unfair economic systems. Development and economic agendas can be drivers of the so-called ecological racism, in the sense that one race is unfairly disadvantaged based on someone else's economic terms and interests. This goes, I believe, with deep-sea mining. As a politician, an indigenous leader, a key political figure in Vanuatu and the region, Perhaps you can tell us your story, Ralph, of the potential risks and link between deep-sea mining and racism. Is there an inherent racism or perhaps injustice and unfairness in deep-sea mining policies and agenda and the mining development agenda as a whole? Hope you can share with us your story, Honorable Ralph.
Thank you, Reverend, and it's an honor for me to be on this webinar. The question as to whether there's an inherent ecological racism behind DSM, I must admit that I'm just hearing for the first time about this concept of ecological racism. To me, the description of inherited form of economic systems of value, it sounds like capitalism to me. It's in the Pacific, we've got to recognize that we are the area of the world with the most colonies still. We're still a largely colonized region of the earth, more than any other region of the earth. We have more colonies in the Pacific than anywhere else. Historically, when let's say the capitalist global system came into the Pacific, which was in around the 1800s for most of us in the South Pacific, the trajectory of history, we went through the whole massive depopulation phase that all indigenous peoples go through when they come into contact with the global capitalist system. And the historical trajectory made it necessary for us to manifest self-determination as the formation of nation states. There was no other historical alternative. There was nothing else we could do. We had to become nation states in the Western model. So it's not our model, nothing to do with that, nothing to do with indigenous Pacific lifeways. This is the Western nation state. We had to adopt and manifest the national will through democracy, and I use inverted commas, the democratic Westminster parliamentary system, most of us have. And this is the only kind of historical option we have, because we are using appropriated cultural forms. So I think that is what is meant by ecological racism, is that we're using forms and systems that were developed somewhere else by other people in other historical contexts, other cultural contexts, and we are now straitjacketed into those ways of being and existing, education, everything like that. The most important things, I think, on the issue of DSM is we now have a system of states, nation states, and states are parasitic in nature. They cannot survive without taxation or resource extraction because they generate nothing themselves. And so this is why all our states around the world are involved in an emphasis on extraction to sustain the state apparatus. On top of this, we have the democratic political system we have, where we have people, we elect our leaders into positions of authority, like myself, I'm a member of parliament, who then have to manifest the national will from a highly compromised position, because we are then reliant on that extraction for our own survival as members of parliament. And so I think in some ways, ecological racism is not helpful when thinking of this issue, because it is our own indigenous Pacific leaders who are making the decision to go down the DSM path because of these structures we are in. Like we've heard from the Cardinal, it was the government of Papua New Guinea who decided to go into DSM. It is the government of Nauru that is putting the hard word on the International Seabird Authority to speed up the development of a legal regime under which DSM could be possible. It's the Cook Islands government. But as you can see from my bio that's come up in the chat, if you read that, I made a very conscious effort when I was in the position as a minister responsible for mining to go out and ask the people and make sure they understood what we're talking about. And there is a role for that. And that is where we need to adapt these systems and move them further towards something which reflects really what the Pacific ethos, what is our spiritual inheritance, our our values. And in the exercise that we did in Vanuatu, we went out and did a consultation about what this issue is, tried to make people as well informed as possible. Trying to obtain this free, prior, informed consent that we've heard about. What we found at the end of it was that everyone was totally opposed to any form of deep sea mining anytime now and into the future. People just couldn't comprehend that you could possibly even think about this. And I think that is the challenge for us now in the Pacific, is to make sure that people are as informed as possible and that they have the means to subject their state leaders to this mandate. And in Vanuatu, we've managed to get all our peak national organizations, the National Council of Women, National Council of Chiefs, National Council of Churches, National Council of Youth, all have come out very clearly to say we do not want DSM anytime now and into the future. And it's going to be very difficult for our government to go against that. I mean, of course, governments will, the democratic model governments disregard the will of the people all the time. And this is a problem with this inherited structures we are in. And I think I will talk more later about how we need to move past this, how we need to develop alternative ways of valuing what we have, alternative measures of well-being. What are our values? How can those values be expressed in our systems of valuing things and making decisions about how we interact with, how we build our societies into the future? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Honorable Ralph, for that deep reflection coming from the Pacific, from your context. The next question is for Maureen. Maureen, we are now in the middle of a climate emergency, and we hear quite often that what we need to do is to move the world into a green economy or into a blue economy. This includes, for example, shifting to electric cars and so forth. And as it happens, the Pacific is also at the front line of climate change impacts. And yet, on top of this, the Pacific could also be hit by another environmental crisis in the sense that the minerals to achieve this so-called renewable energy vision, as it happens, comes from the bottom of the Pacific Ocean. And we wonder, what are your thoughts on this? And also we wonder if there are any racial connotations to this development narrative.
Thank you, Anthea, for this really complex question, but also perhaps to really just take on from where Ralph left off, because I think it's really important for most people in the global South, but also Indigenous people. This development narrative is not new. I mean, we've been persuaded through, and we have real experiences around these kinds of narratives. And our first real big interaction with these kinds of global narratives really was in the form of nuclear tests, where the Pacific was presented as the proving ground under these complex global narratives of mankind. And if you look at it from a resource and mining point of view, we've been here before. We've been presented that this is going to be our salvation. And I think increasingly, it's very worrying. And I think Ralph's point that when we look at this from, and for me, it's also a new concept, this idea of ecological racism. The challenge that we have right now is that we have 5 Pacific Island countries, Nauru, Kiribati, Tonga, Cook Islands, and now Tuvalu, who are at the forefront and using this same narrative that they're presented with, that these minerals are necessary for this green transition. But the transition is, again, we have to really push back on who is this transition necessary for. As people who are, and the contradictions are very well and clearly seen. On the one hand, our countries are considered the moral authority on the question of climate crisis. And on the other hand, we are going to be at the forefront of a race in an area that I think is very poorly understood. So I want to come back to values of the ocean in relation to climate and climate function. And I think the science, there's a huge gap in the science that still needs to be filled, and our governments need to grapple with, because we cannot be on the global scene arguing that we are faced with an existential crisis and complicit and implicated in our actions around deep sea mining. We know that the oceans is the largest carbon sink. Its role in terms of sequestering carbon is quite significant. And so some real fun facts that we need to keep in mind, and our governments need to keep in mind, is that 83% of global carbon cycle is circulated through the oceans. Coastal habitats, which only cover less than 2% of the ocean area, but they account for approximately half of total carbon sequestered in ocean sediment. Living organisms that sequester carbon, and this is really, really neat when you think about it. So two ways: the carbon absorbs, the ocean absorbs, dissolves carbon, but also the living organisms also absorb and hold carbon. So something like a whale can sequester up to 33 tons of carbon dioxide on average. And they store this on the sediment floor of the ocean. The ocean absorbs heat, significant amount of heat that we produce, and particularly humans produce. Every second breath that we take, oxygen, is thanks to the functions of the ocean. So from a climate perspective, what it really, really says to me and to many of us is that our governments have really overlooked where the real value of oceans in terms of climate sit, and are now prioritizing the agenda, particularly of mining companies and proponents of DSM, that the value sits on these minerals. They haven't calculated what it means. So now we know, the science is now showing us that other activities like bottom trawling will disturb the carbon storage function of the ocean. We also know that equipment, that are dropped will disturb. So when you think about it in terms of scale, our countries have got to figure out whether they will consider themselves as possible net polluters of greenhouse gas emissions through deep sea mining. But we certainly need to up the pressure on our governments, and particularly climate champions of the Pacific, to consider this. The second key thing that we need to think about is in relation to methane seeps, which sits on vents and on the seafloor. Again, the science remains, there's a gap in our science and understanding about what will happen in the event that we hit one of these methane gas seeps that sits on the ocean floor. Methane as a greenhouse gas is probably one of the most potent greenhouse gases, and scientists are now saying that if we hit one of those inadvertently, whether through bottom trawling, laying of cables, or deep sea mining, then we are going to change our understanding about greenhouse gas emissions, and it would be disastrous for the Pacific. So I think the wearing of and the use of climate and green technology is a false argument that our governments fully do not appreciate, and the science needs to come strong to challenge our governments, who are the moral authorities on climate change. and the fact that we really experience existential crisis at this point of view. So I'm going to come back. I think it's very important that we come back to understanding the value of the ocean in terms of mitigation and adaptation as we move.
Yeah, thank you, Maureen, for sharing that. I think that is very important information that you've shared with us to shed light on the importance of what you spoke about. We are mindful of the time that we have at the moment. Quite still few Talanoa guides that we need to go through. Perhaps I would ask the patience and also the perhaps endorsement of our speakers that we now move on to part 4, moratorium local developments, because I think these two parts towards the end of our Talanoa is very critical for our time. And I would like to ask to please focus on our minutes, perhaps 3 the most, to answer or Talanoa in some of the key points. Dr. Kristina, there is a call for a moratorium from faith-based organizations, civil societies, and ocean activists. If we are serious about controlling deep-sea mining, what does a moratorium look like? What are its benefits, values, as Maureen was talking about, and who will benefit?
Well, thank you for the highly complicated question. That was my own organization, IUCN, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, had a meeting in September of this year where its members, state organizations, as well as non-governmental organizations, adopted a resolution calling for a moratorium on deep seabed mining. This moratorium is framed in the context of unless and until. There are other types of moratorium that are calling for a complete ban, but most generally that the term moratorium means unless and until. And what the IUCN resolution is specifically calling for is a moratorium unless and until the risks of seabed mining are comprehensively understood and effective protection can be ensured as required by the Law of the Sea Convention, that the precautionary principle, ecosystem-based management, and the polluter pays principle are actually incorporated into any draft regulations, that alternatives to deep sea minerals in battery production are actually developed and implemented, that we actually start this transition to the circular economy and clean up terrestrial mining operations. The public consultation mechanisms are incorporated, and we actually implement what Dr. Catherine was talking about in terms of free, prior, and informed consent of Indigenous peoples, as well as informed consent of potentially affected communities. And then fifth, perhaps as important, is that the International Seabed Authority itself, the governance structure, the accountability of members, as well as the Secretariat, is opened, is transparent, and is actually reformed, so it does not become an institution that is promoting seabed mining, incentivizing seabed mining through its payment regime, but rather actually promoting its other mandates for marine scientific research, capacity, equity, and benefits. But there are other types of real questions that need to be addressed. And this is what the scientist statement that Dr. Catherine and Maureen have also been referring to, is scientists say we simply need many years of research if we are going to answer some of these fundamental questions about what is it you do actually lose if you do commence to open up an entire new ecosystem environment to deep seabed mining. What will be the effects on commercial fisheries? What will be the effects on the entire water column, and how will this affect our livelihoods in coastal communities? Would say fishing organizations are supporting a moratorium. Industry is saying we truly do need to clean up our supply chain. So the benefits of a moratorium would be that we actually buy ourselves time to contemplate, do we truly need seabed minerals? Do we have alternatives that can be sought first? And how do we actually develop the science basis that we need to ensure that free, prior, and informed consent? I would say that social license to go where no man literally has gone before is absolutely critical when you are launching such a new and massive scale enterprise that could have widespread, long-lasting, and severe impacts. I would say that the work on ecocide is something that we also need to be looking into, because there they are actually talking about wanton destruction as being suggested as should be included as an international crime against humanity. The benefits will buy us time to have cleaner air, cleaner water, a better climate. And I think for the Pacific, and we in the Western world can learn from the Pacific communities to try to live more in harmony with nature. And perhaps right now, the biggest benefit for the Pacific region that I could say is to reduce that tension between the countries that are actually being pushed to promote seabed mining because of desperate economic conditions. Give them the time to find those sustainable alternatives that we're all looking for. Thank you.
Thanks, Kristina, for sharing the benefits of a moratorium. Now we move on to Honorable Ralph. So we spoke about the moratorium, but is this moratorium enough for the Pacific region? Should we create a moratorium just to control the mining? Or should we say that the Pacific does not need any mining at all, that mining has to stop?
Thank you for the question. And I think Kristina has pretty much said what needs to be said about a moratorium. And I think my personal view, of course, is that we need to take deep sea bed mining off the menu completely so that Pacific Island countries can plan their futures without this as an option for all the reasons we've already heard about. But of course, we need to, it's the people of the Pacific who need to make this decision after free, prior, informed consent, a genuine free, prior, informed consent of the people. And a moratorium, given, as Kristina just mentioned, given the fact that Pacific Island countries are some of the leading countries talking about DSM at the moment, we need to utilize a moratorium as a measure. We need to utilize any measures we can that bring us to the table, that buy us time, that get us talking, that get us thinking more deeply about this issue before taking up that option. So for me, I would like to see the menu, it taken completely off the menu, just banned forever. But any way we can get there, and a moratorium obviously is one of those, get these countries back to talking as a region about how we move forward on this issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Ralph. Maureen, I think we follow the talanoa from Ralph, in particular the countries who are applying for mining license through the International Seabed Mining Authority, mainly to improve their GDP. And I think Ralph touched that very clearly in the beginning of our talanoa. Perhaps, but I think the question is that, is it worth the risk of mining to meet the needs of this present generation at the expense of our future generation? And is it perhaps adding to this, is it ethical to sacrifice the bottom of the ocean, central to the life and livelihoods of the Pacific people, for example, for something that is, a green economy or blue economy that is happening elsewhere in the world?
Thank you, Dr. Upolu. And maybe just really pushing us a little bit more, I want to respond to this important question in three ways. One is burden of proof, due diligence, and really come back to this question of free, prior, informed consent. And I think one of the biggest challenges that we've had since DSM became part of the menu is that it removed, as Ralph clearly points out, this this only option. And I think what it says today is that our governments have really, there's a desperate of imaginations about how we should develop. And I think that's quite stark when it is placed only as the only option for GDP. But on the question of burden of proof, and we've known this since we started working on this area, is that when governments and proponents of mining, of DSM come through, they simply make these assertions that it will improve the GDP and we will benefit. And they have done very little to demonstrate the burden of proof. And in fact, what they've done is to disproportionately put our communities to prove why this is a bad proposition that we should simply remove off the table. So our communities have had to demonstrate through different value systems, learning to engage this issue. And so the burden of proof has shifted. And now we're shifting it again to civil society actors to demonstrate that this is a bad proposition. Our governments, mining companies haven't done enough to prove that this is going to be the case in point. Secondly, on the question of due diligence, and I think the complicitness of many of our technical agencies in the Pacific, the way DSM has been framed from the onset by institutions such as SOPAC, formerly known as SOPAC, is this framing that it is very little to no impact and significant benefits and reward has become at the heart of this contention. Our governments failed on the onset to consult. And as Catherine pointed out earlier in her intervention, they failed because they didn't see Indigenous peoples as having any role to play or having anything to say about these minerals that sit on the bottom of our seafloors, 200 meters deep down, if you like. The view of the state is that these minerals belong to the state, and they only had to consult at a very minimum. So in many ways, they do not have the consent of our governments, do not, at this precise point in time, do not have the free, prior, informed consent of our people to move in the ways that they're moving within our economic exclusive zones or in the high seas, in areas in the common heritage of mankind. And I think it's worth stating it so that people understand, and particularly the global community understand, that there is a contestation around consent. Indigenous communities will view DSM as a desecration of sites that are both spiritual, ecological. We talk about well-being. This is a desecration of which they have said firmly from 2010, 11, 12, no. The Pacific Blue Line Collective have also joined in to support that. But we've been consulting in the region for a long time to challenge our governments and proponents to shift the burden of proof beyond our people on why we should remove this as an option. If our governments want to talk about development, then let's talk about development. But if we are only presented with one way to develop our countries, then this is problematic. And this is where the contention lies, is that it's been framed, and the complicity of our technical agencies should be called out, because we are now in a place where our communities are challenging elected governments in terms of where they want to go with this particular proposition. Thank you, Upolu.
Thank you so much, Maureen. And building on what Maureen has said, I have a question now for Honorable Ralph. Obviously, the issue of deep sea mining is something that has to be addressed collectively by the entire Pacific region. And so a Pacific household or a Pacific IGA approach is critical. And of course, you are a regional political figure. And I was wondering if you could share some key areas that the Pacific region needs to strengthen in order to deal with the challenge of deep sea mining?
Thank you. Yes, we need to deal at a regional level to get these changes in ocean policy, because the Pacific is our home. There are no boundaries to the Pacific. The Pacific is all of us. We have to be very conscious that there is no environmental baseline for the Pacific region that we could use to measure any impact on the ocean of any activity. There is no regional environmental baseline. So when you're talking about environmental impact assessment, it's not possible because this is a regional issue, and the oceans, we're all in the ocean. We are now faced with, for example, the Japanese government deciding to dump, 1 million liters of contaminated nuclear water waste into the Pacific. And of course, that's going to affect us all. This is a similar issue. This will it'll be transboundary. It'll be a transboundary harm under the Convention on the Law of the Sea. So it's important that Pacific leaders, and everyone needs to make sure the Pacific leaders talk together in a way to create policies that will benefit Pacific marine resource conservation and use as a whole. And there are a number of things that need to be done. Regional marine spatial planning, for example. We are doing marine spatial planning in Vanuatu, but it needs to happen across the region, and that isn't got to that stage yet. These are things that need to happen before you can even consider possibly deep sea mining, as some are. We have statements that have been made in the region, the Palau Declaration, the Pohnpei Ocean Statement. We have these statements of intent of Pacific leaders. And I think in this area of seabed mining, rather than each country working as it is in this mutually exclusive way, we need to make sure that we're talking together. And governments need to reach out. For example, Vanuatu needs to reach out to the governments of Nauru, Cook Islands, Tuvalu, and say, look, let's talk about this. Bring this back to the table. Let's talk about it. Let's talk about all these declarations we've made about the conservation of the marine resource. Let's talk about some of the regional models that are working. For example, in tuna management, there are some countries that have formed the Nauru Agreement that seems to be a new way of working that is able to talk about marine resource conservation at a regional level that involves a number of countries. Let's do something like this for deep sea mining. And I think it's an important time now for pressure to be put on our leaders to talk among each other to make sure that this regional policy development and implementation on ocean policy happens. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ralph. That is very important to start now to take us forward to where we see in the next steps that we need to move into. Perhaps because of time constraint that we have, we are mindful of that. Perhaps this would be our last Talanoa guide. We would like to ask Your Eminence, Cardinal, and I'm sure Dr. Kristina and others can share their Talanoa as well when the questions are given to the speakers. But I'm sure as a leader of the Catholic Church in the Pacific, and from your experience as a faith and community leader, can you share briefly what are some of the key areas we need to improve to strengthen what we mean collective ecological stewardship in the region? And perhaps within that collective action, identifying some of the injustices and the racial discriminations in some of the development models that we have, including deep sea mining.
Okay. With the questions in this situation here, it is important that as people of the Pacific, we need to come together and discuss matters. I'm not sure if this has happened, that the politicians of the Pacific come together, and those who are really concerned in this ministry here come together and talk about this so that we have an idea. There are many ideas, but an idea that unites us together to move together to address an issue that affects all of us, and that we are united to be able to address issues like this. And this is very important, and therefore addressing the crisis of relationship among peoples, races, and nations that is affecting the integrity of creation and thus the climate change. And this is the global platform. For example, Laudato Si. That's a movement in which the ocean is a part of it. So if we use if we make use of these existing platforms and media, of educating individuals, families, communities, and nations of ecological responsibility and conversion, our acts put together will surely create a positive impact and a change in all levels of our sectors. You know, I see this as a very important, and also not only yourself, we have started to move on this on the Pacific level. For example, on the churches coming together, we have the Pacific Council of Churches, and that's where we come together and we see common issues together, and issues that are affecting us. And for example, I remember this seabed mining when it came new in the 2010, 11 upwards like that. We were kind of moving together. In one of those, one of the first conference we have in Fiji, we staged, at that time we staged together. We said that let the whole Pacific region, that seabed mining should be banned for all the Pacific regions. And so we were thinking of, you know, big governments and small state governments. We were all united to be able to talk like that. And we issue a statement and our stand as churches to be united. And that was one voice we were able to stand together and voice that very important stand by the churches to stop all this the seabed mining in the Pacific region. And so, and with the Laudato Si, it's really in there that we see that the church should really embark on educating our people and making our people aware that they are also responsible to make sure that our environment is respected, and the church is really the voice of those, the unheard people, our simple people, our people in the grassroots. So we are kind of representing them and working towards making them aware of it, and that they should be also the strong voice. And I still recall why the churches were strong in PNG to be able to be united, calling the government to stop and cancel the license of the seabed mining granted to Nautilus. Now we saw that it was really important that this is a new venture. We were not aware of anything. The government did not make it clear to us what it means, the negative impacts and all that we never knew of. And even I myself, I was able to meet one of those in Kavieng, where the mining was centering to begin. And I asked those in the fisheries, those who work in the fisheries department there, and I asked him, what are you doing to be able to give us information about this? And then he said, we haven't done anything. We have not we do not know what to do here. So this is something that is coming from outside, coming in here to us, and we do not know what is really happening here. So you see, such thing like this calls for a better way of how we can work together. And at that time also, I remember, there was no policy on seabed mining. We have policy on land, of course. Seabed mining was a new thing, And we did not know how to be able to deal with it and how to monitor it and how to see and find out what is really the negative impact. And so for us here, our intention will be to make sure that we know exactly what is happening and what will affect us. And as we say, that for us, for our islands and so on, we are related so much to the sea. And the sea is very important to us. Our ocean is very important to us. And as was expressed by one of our speakers also, that we have our relationship with the sea and with the land. And it comes to us, for example, in relation to our culture, in relation to our spiritual lives, and to our inheritance. So these are important for us to be able to work on. And it's really everyone, the political circle, the churches, and also the leaders of our countries. And that's why it's important that we come to be able to air this and help our people to do this. And therefore, to look at the churches coming together, I believe this, because the churches, we may have some idea, some understanding, but we need, as we were saying here in PNG, you said, we need the technical people to lead us and make us aware of how we can really move forward from here. One of the things I must say here, the license given to Nautilus, okay, Nautilus is already not functioning. They ran into bankruptcy and they are not functioning anymore. But the thing is that the license is very much still alive. And that is our concern. That was our intention, to be able to make sure that how do we continue to stand together and to be vigilant when the government is moving its way, but not consulting the people, not making people aware of the impact and all what will happen to them. The churches are saying, let us be firm, standing together and be able to face this and be vigilant to know what is actually happening. And also some agencies in government circle helping us also to be able to understand this. So for me, this is what I would say, for us to move forward is to be able to be united and be engaged in a movement like Laudato Si. It's a Catholic movement that really looks at the environment, looks at the life of the people, and make sure that everyone is protected well. The concern for us is to make awareness that really helps to educate our people and helps us to be able to move forward with an understanding that unites us and fights for a right that helps us to exist in our own environment, where no approach from outside that will destroy us. And that's what we want to kind of move on with at this time, because that is our concern. And for our Pacific people, this is what I would say. Our islanders, our Pacific islanders, they have no backup monetary fund, nothing. There's no insurance for them. The only insurance are what we have, life in the sea, and also our relationship with our land and with one another. That's all what we have. And when these are destroyed, and especially sea is very much part of us. We cannot say that the sea is not part of us. You know, our life in the Pacific, our life on land has an extension, and that is with the sea also. So we cannot separate these two. And that's why it's very important that we kind of united together, the government, the churches, and our people, to move in an understanding that protects us and helps us to be comfortable knowing where we are and are able to approach a situation that comes in with better understanding in a way that we address it in a more united way. So for me, this is what it is. And Laudato Si kind of explains a little more that was about our environment, about our relationship, and about really those affected, the poor ones and those who will be badly affected by such development as this. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Your Eminence. And now, friends, we move on to the question and answer part of our webinar. Unfortunately, we don't have that much time, so we do really apologize. We really do appreciate the thought-provoking contributions of our speakers. But now we hear, I think we can take one question. I'm struggling to choose which one at the moment, but we are collecting all of these questions. And I think there is this one that has stood out, it is, the question is it really helpful, or is it helpful to speak of ecological racism? I'm talking about deep sea mining, when it is primarily coming from a particular cultural or economic perspective, which stems from a Western worldview, but one that is not perhaps exclusive to a particular race. So the question is whether ecological racism is a useful and helpful framework. I will ask perhaps Maureen and also perhaps Catherine to reflect in a minute or so, if it's possible, and what your views are this question.
I think as indicated before, this is certainly a new terminology for me. I think we really understand the kinds of different power dynamics. I think it's really important to understand the kinds of structural powers that we're dealing with in the context of deep sea mining. I think we should also really understand how Pacific People's Agency, including political agency, is being used. And I think if people want to interpret that as racist, I think that's fine. But I think it's really, really important for me. I think Ralph hit it on the head. We're talking about capitalism. We're talking about a set of colonial constructs, which is now overlaid into a complicated sets of dynamics around climate and the climate crisis. So I think that's quite problematic. I think going forward, it would be very, very useful for us to reconsider how we discuss DSM, and particularly to pick up on Kristina's point around where the highly industrial countries sit. Because I think the key thing is that minerals will sit in jurisdictions such as the Pacific, but its endpoints and its beneficiaries around will be coming from highly industrialized countries. And I think the conversation needs to move into a space where we look at the kinds of global responsibilities through a green technological revolution, if you like. What sets of responsibilities should we place on the developed world to respond to? Because I really think that this perpetuated insistence on looking at the Pacific in a very narrow way really, really limits and restricts us. So that would be my way of responding, that I think we should reconsider the kinds of power dynamics. We should pull into this particular frame of Talanoa the sets of responsibilities and obligations that developed nations have, who are driving a lot of these agendas, to bring them to this table. Because at the moment, we are just talking about what we Pacific people can do, and we've been doing this for a while. Our message is extremely clear to the global community. We are very, very clear that this cannot, under any circumstances, there's no consent to this particular industry going forward.
Thank you so much, Maureen. Catherine?
Well, I would just really want to echo everything Maureen just said, and also, everything we've heard tonight. I just think people need to understand that when they allow mining companies to become part of their development plan, which is what we've been hearing tonight, what you're bringing in with that mining company are legal structures that have been put in place to protect the interests and the benefits and the profits of that corporation, and the companies and the countries behind those corporations. So you get contracts, confidential contracts that have all kinds of clauses in them that mean that the company ends up paying very little, if any, taxes, and in fact binds your countries to having to, if they dispute this, if they dispute the taxes, for example, they have to dispute that in international tribunals. And since 2016, mining companies all over the world have been suing governments, and they've sued them for it's right now it's up to $53 billion, and only 39% of the time do those countries win. They almost always lose. So, you know, there's international legal structures that come with a mining company that will protect its interests and the countries behind it, the wealthy countries behind it, to the detriment of developing countries. And we've seen this over and over again in terrestrial mining. It won't be any different with seabed mining. So, you know, my concern is that even if a country in the Pacific were willing to sacrifice the seabed for development, that development won't come. It won't come from the mining. In fact, it'll be further behind, because it will now also have lost the real source of wealth, which is a healthy, intact sea. So I think that is the way we have to look at it, and that is capitalism, right? That is capitalism, exactly what Honorable Ralph said. And I think we don't need to invent new terms. We have the terms. We have colonialism, we have capitalism. We know what's going on. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you so much, Catherine. I will now hand over to Arnie Saiki, who is a writer, who is a researcher and an activist. And he will be sharing with us a mapping of some of the concepts and issues that have come out of our Talanoa. And if you can do it, Arnie, in 3 minutes, that would be excellent.
Well, hello, thanks for having me. This was very exciting and of course very difficult because there's been so much information. But in terms of my mapping, I'm not going to reiterate what everyone says, but just sort of kind of give you an example of just a quick highlight of you know, just the kind of frantic note-taking that I was taking with all of these various terms from Maureen and Kristina and Ralph and His Eminence and stuff. And I just want to say that you know, disentangling, I think one of the things that we've that I think everyone agrees upon is that disentangling DSM from the Pacific, you know, is indeed a moral obligation. And it does sort of speak to this kind of systemic racism or this disregard that we have for ecological biodiversity. And I think terms like existentialism, capitalism, colonialism, that Catherine, you know, just mentioned, you know, is absolutely a profound way of describing, you know, the kind of assault that the Pacific has gone through over the last, you know, hundreds of years. And DSM, deep seabed mining, is certainly an extension of that. I think Upolu, you know, he wrote earlier that ecological racism is what happens when one race, you know, Earth included, is unfairly disadvantaged based on someone else's economic terms and interests. And I think, you know, one of the other really deep moments was when Kristina, you know, sort of mentioned, or where was it? You know, called DSM, you know, a crime against humanity. And I think, you know, many of the speakers used terms like, you know, crimes against, you know, these kinds of very, very strong language to describe deep seabed mining, because I think in effect deep seabed mining, you know, is a very strong and powerful assault. And you know, we can't really speak about this assault on just the kind of regular terms that we generally talk about when we talk about mining or extractive industries, you know, on land. I think, you know, much of the conversations around free, prior, informed consent and the precautionary principle and existentialism is important, and I also think that what Maureen also brings up around the issue of values, and what both he and Ralph and everyone else began to talk about it around values, and using GDP is very strong, because we have to think about what are Pacific values, and how does GDP then begin to measure our notions of what a Pacific of what a traditional system is, or what a value system is, based upon the value system of the advanced economies, or the rich countries. Clearly in the Pacific, GDP does not work, and I guess that there's so many notes I can't even make sense of them, but yeah, I mean, I guess it's this challenge. What is challenging is, and again, Maureen also brings this up, is a schizophrenia for the Pacific to be on the one hand, be on the forefront of climate change, and on the other hand, also be on the forefront of embracing extractive industries, and specifically deep seabed mining. It really just makes no sense. I think where I would begin to look further is looking at Dr. Kristina's work at all of the sort of at the legal apparatus on the one hand, and then on the other hand looking at the work that Ralph has done, and what His Excellence has done, working with on the ground communities in terms of trying to organize peoples of the Pacific, in order to, number one, make them aware, to provide a semblance of knowledge of what DSM is, so that it's not merely a consultation, but that we can, a real process for free, prior, and informed consent.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks.
That was a lot.
Oh my God, it
to
was so
process,
much.
Arnie. We gave you an impossible task.
You did. Look at this. All right.
So thank you. I will now pass on to my co-moderator, Upolu.
Right. I think we will finish the webinar, since we'll quite over our time, intended time, but thank you indeed to our distinguished speakers and community leaders for your rare yet valuable talanoa about our issue at hand. As one wisdom saying in Pacific goes, when a bonito fishing expedition returns with a huge catch, even the child who assists in dragging the canoe on land gets a fish. We believe that the global community, global family, attending our webinar today has received the mau, the gift of koloa, from your vast ocean of knowledge and experience. We thank you indeed for allowing your time and share your stories despite your own busy schedule. We thank our participants, our organizing committee, as well as G20 Interfaith Forum for creating this space for our talanoa. We dedicate this webinar to the memory of our Pacifica communities who fought and are still fighting for political and economic self-determination in our Sea of Islands. To those who continue to struggle under economic and ecological racism of various forms. Our history is not written in a remote heavenly abode, but rather in the lives and memories of those who continue to struggle and get to see the world not in a light of money, but rather in a light of life-giving interconnected relationships grounded in a whole of life vision of justice. We look forward to more talanoa on this critical issue of our time in the future. Fa'afeteitele lava, and God bless. God bless our speakers for today, and God bless all our participants and viewers today. Malo, fa'afetai.
Thank you, everyone.
Naka, thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.